Advance at UNM. And I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I'm going to ask Sandy to start recording this, please. Today, we're really excited to have Nancy Lewis and Heather Canavan with us to talk about some different ways to think about your research and research planning. I'm always really enjoy being able to introduce Heather. I actually hired her when I was chair of what was then chemical and nuclear engineering. She is a highly accomplished professor of what is now chemical and biological engineering, and I enjoy her accomplishments at least as much as she does. And Nancy Lewis is currently the director of the Innovation Academy's Canopy for Creative Collaboration. She has previously been a lecturer in speech and hearing sciences and done a number of other really interesting things. They have, through some different paths, developed expertise and interest in using universal design in research and teaching. And I appreciate their being with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to them. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. And welcome, everyone. We're happy you're here, and we'd like to thank Julia and the good folks at Advance for inviting us to talk today. So today we'll be talking about a few design methodologies that can really help improve your problem solving and your research planning. We'll talk about universal design. We'll talk about wrong theory and design thinking. We'll show some examples of what we're calling flawed research design, and then really dig into what are the hidden barriers that actually lead to these flawed designs. And then we'll have a little bit of hands-on time for you to use some of these problem-solving methodologies that we'll talk about to apply to your work. So with this, I'll turn it over to Heather.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk first about universal design. This is a whole area of research that, depending on what part of campus you're on, it could be something that is old hat to you, or it could be something that you've not heard of. This is the idea that our structures, our products, our spaces should be designed with the idea that they should be useful and usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without need for adaptation or specialized design. There are a lot of different things that go into this. It includes things like equitable use. And by that, they mean like, if you build a building that doesn't have anything but stairs, you know that you won't be able to have access by wheelchair users. There's also flexibility, making it simple, intuitive, etc. We're not going to talk about all of that. What we're just really thinking of is if we're trying to move towards developing research programs that are useful to all students, and we're trying to increase diversity and inclusion, let's think about equitable use first. So that's what sort of a background on universal design is. So if you could go to the next slide.
Sure.
Okay, so again, this is just highlighting there are many, many different ways of approaching this. If you are someone who's in occupational therapy, physical therapy, nursing, etc., you are probably far more used to this whole area of research into universal design than science and engineering and so forth. But again, I'm literally only going to be talking about the equitable use. So next one again. Okay, so here is a slide, a cartoon that my student, now postdoc, Ty Martin, created. And this is the idea of, on the far left, we've got, a whole bunch of people are trying to watch the balloon fiesta, the balloons taking off. Obviously not made this year, but it was made last year. And Ty is a wheelchair user. He has been for 20 years. He has muscular dystrophy. And so, as with many people, he has issues of not having equitable access. process. And so the idea is a lot of first order changes are what we have done in the past, which is, okay, well, if shorter people or people who are in wheelchairs can't see over the fence, let's build a ramp so that they have equitable access. That's really a first order change. And what we're trying to move towards is second order changes. So this is language that's maybe more comfortable to those of us in chemistry, physics, engineering, and so forth. A second order change would really be just removing the barrier altogether. But in order to understand how to remove the barrier, we have to know what it is, right? So this is his cartoon explaining that. And if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so back to Nancy.
Yeah, so wrong theory, like Heather said about universal design, it might be a concept that you've heard about or something that you haven't heard of, where it's a protocol that helps you reconfigure the traditional brainstorming process in a way that can help you arrive at solutions that are novel and will really work. We're really fortunate at UNM to have an expert in wrong theory, Professor Vanessa Spila, who works out of the oils department. She's done extensive research on this and has tons of resources on her website. So we've listed it here. And wrong theory is kind of, when you first learn about it, it's kind of like, what? So it's an invitation to come up with designs that are not just terrible, but even harmful or humiliating. And the reason that you do that is that it's believed that it helps you both understand the problem that you're designing for and helps you break free from kind of a this or that solution approach. And it really can help you move your research outcomes, research planning and outcomes from being incremental to being transformative and even innovative. So Heather's going to give a couple of examples.
Right. And so I think we're all, you know, when Nancy was just talking about incremental research, we've all had research projects where, you know, first I develop a methodology, then I test it on this type of system, and that's the next paper. Then I test it on another type of system, and that's the next paper. And that is what I think of as incremental research. I'm not belittling it because it's really important to the scientific literature to do that kind of careful methodical research. But when you are looking for something that's truly transformative, it can be very hard to get out of that mindset where, you know, the this or that comment, I don't know if you remember the song by Black Sheep in the 90s, you can go with this or you can go with that. You can go with this or you can go with that. And it's just like, you know, you either have to go with the Democrat or the Republican. You either have to have half the people on the Supreme Court are women, or it's only hiring by who's the most qualified. You get locked into that mentality. It's hard to break out of it. And again, as Nancy said, this is not just a bad design, this is purposefully wrong design. So on the left of the slide here, I've got a bad design, and this is just thoughtless. They're not thinking of who is going to be the user. In this case, they're putting this 3M wrap around a bus, and they have to have the school logo there to make sure that everybody knows to stop. But here it looks like they're trying to say, take action, take control, and quit school, which is not the method or the idea they're trying to get across. That's just stupid design or bad design. But on the right, I don't know how many of you have been to the restaurant Vinaigrette down in, there's one in Santa Fe and there's one downtown in Albuquerque, but Nancy and I both immediately thought of the cleverness that they had tried to use for the bathroom designs where you couldn't tell which of the two you were supposed to be. And I think that in truth, it was probably just bad or thoughtless design, but really a wrong design is something that is purposeful, and you're trying to create harm and humiliation to the user. And how Vanessa uses this is to say, let's really create the worst possible design using wrong theory, and use that to break out of the this or that mentality so that maybe we can come up with a more creative and transformative idea. So next slide. Okay, so the next slide, we have a prompt here, and actually Nancy's going to lead this guy.
So we thought we'd use the chat and invite you to list your ideas for designing a new doorknob with, now that you've just very quickly been introduced possibly to wrong theory. Think about doorknobs that could cause harm and humiliation. So not just like a bad doorknob, but like the worst doorknob you can imagine that would actually be perilous, possibly perilous to use. So just for the sake of time, we're going to ask people to put their responses in the chat box.
And Nancy, can you give us like 45 seconds on our clock?
I can try.
Right.
Yes.
So a doorknob with a square handle and pointy corners. I love it. Pointy corners are going to cause pain. A square doorknob is confusing, one that we've not seen. Spikes on the doorknob. The knob is covered, is digital touch, but only works with your nose. I love that. The idea of having to stick my nose, especially during the Corona times, onto a highly used surface is awful. If it's covered in oil, creates an electric shock. That's perfect. Ooh, chewing gum. Tamara Janisar, that is a perfect idea because chewing gum super grosses me out even before the Corona times. The button opens at the opposite end of the room. You have to run to it in time before it slams shut. That's perfect. I would definitely fail that. Spikes on the handle and you have to push it up. That's a great idea because that's going to cause pain. Located at the very top of the door, perfect. People who are short, people in wheelchairs are not going to be able to do it. Razor doorknob, that is great. These are all creating harm and humiliation. Now, the idea is that if you hadn't gone through this particular type of exercise, if you were asked to design a new doorknob, you might be thinking something like, okay, well, I'm going to make it a paddle shape instead of a round shape, which is a good improvement for people who have limited mobility or they have hyperflexibility or something, but it's not really that transformative. You guys have come up with making it non-functional, making it harmful, and so forth. So if I asked you now how to create a better doorknob for someone who is in a wheelchair, let's say, try and give me a couple of ideas of what would be a better doorknob for someone who is in a wheelchair. Now that we've done wrong thinking, now let's step back and try and do something right. So can you guys, again, let's have 30 seconds and go through this. Any ideas for new doorknob designs for people with wheelchair access? This one's a little harder, but adjustable height, vertical, remote control, automatic doors with a motion sensor, lever with a rope hanging from the end. I love that. That's not something we would have thought of before. It's not attached necessarily. Another remote control, another motion sensor. Absolutely. Those are great ways of going about it. So that is basically wrong theory in action. Okay. Again, the idea being that if you're trying to break out of this idea of being incremental in your approach to a problem, let's think of the worst possible idea and then sit back and say, what are we really trying to get at, and move forward. Now, if you're really interested in wrong theory, we did have on the one of the previous slides a link to Vanessa's websites, and she's got a whole series of, yeah, there it is. She's got the protocol there. She's got things that people can do in their classes and with their teams. I highly recommend it. It really is something that helps us break free of our limitations. Okay,
She's
so let's
very generous with all of her resources.
Really is
extremely generous. Yeah. So we're going to move on to design thinking. This is another methodology that may or may not be, that you may or may not be familiar with. Design thinking is really a set of tools and processes that help you create a mindset towards that you can take into any problem-solving activity. It was popularized by the Stanford Design School and really has its roots in product design. Actually, the mouse was the guy that also popularized this, David Kelly, who was at Stanford and then started a business called IDEO.com, which is kind of the mecca for design thinking using in product design. He is credited for using design thinking to develop the mouse as opposed to just the little IBM cursor that was, or IBM little dot that was in the middle of the keyboard a long time ago. So design thinking is a system of processes and tools that appear somewhat linear here, but they are not, sorry about that. They're really more cyclical in nature. And design thinking has its roots in what is called empathy or empathizing. So the idea is that you really do things to come to know your end user or your end beneficiary in a way that may lead you to define and redefine your problem statement. You might learn by, through some ethnographic research methods, that the problem that you thought you were trying to solve really isn't the core problem. And so you bring back this data, you kind of flesh it out and define or redefine your problem statement. Then design thinking talks about using this process they call ideate, which is brainstorming with some kind of more expansive rules. And ideating is really, as is design thinking, it's really a process of divergent and convergent thinking. And really, in a lot of ways, I think we do that. I mean, we're very accustomed to divergent and convergent thinking, but we do it more times in design thinking. I think we a lot of times might brainstorm and then kind of narrow it down, come to a solution and hit go. And design thinking really has you go back and forth at different points in terms of this diverging and converging your thinking. Prototyping or making quick, low resolution mock-ups of your ideas is part of design thinking. The idea being that you really want to have some 3D representation of your idea in order to get feedback so that you can rapidly iterate your idea and for improvement's sake. And again, I think a lot of times Stanford talks about having your precious, the idea being kind of very precious, and you really have to let go of the preciousness of your idea because you're willing to do this prototyping, testing, rapid iteration. So your original idea may not look like the final prototype that you actually decide to implement or launch or go to market with. If you've heard about design thinking or read anything, chances are you've seen this schematic from the Stanford D School. And I like this schematic because it lists some of the activities and kind of the mindset that goes along with this process. Unfortunately, it does look very linear in this lineup, whereas this one at least shows you that you may have to kind of backtrack to, for example, you might prototype something and get some feedback that tells you that you've really missed the mark. So you'd go back to maybe getting a little more user information, redefining the problem, ideating again, and then come up with a different prototype. So there's lots of different ways to flesh out these different processes. And the real nugget for design thinking, in my opinion, is that you've got to come to the problem recognizing that a collaborative brain is better than a solo brain, and also that you may or may not have the solution and you may not even be framing the problem correctly. And I don't think we always approach things in that way. So it's a really great process that helps you develop this mindset around how to approach any kind of problem or challenge. So this is one more visual that fleshes out design thinking the design thinking process a little bit more, and really talks, we're kind of looking through these different lenses as to what does a design thinker, how does a design thinker behave? So it involves this gathering data through this immersion, and through what you bring to that as a design thinker is this empathy and curiosity. From that data, you identify insights, which is really sense making of your data, and you've got to be confident and somewhat inspired in the data that in order to make these insights. And I recently heard somebody actually who works at IDEO say that it's your insights that are really the moneymaker. So you've got to be clear enough about the data that you've collected to really understand and feel confident that the problem statement is actually the problem. Then you align your design criteria in a way that's very human-centered, user-driven. You generate lots of ideas, and you've got to have this comfort with co-creation and difference. And prototyping is really a way to visualize the idea. And everybody always thinks about, well, almost always thinks about like an app to prototype, but you can actually prototype processes or systems level change as well. And it's really a way to take the idea from your mind to something that you could actually hold in your hand in order to get feedback on. And then finally, testing, learning from this testing activity and getting ready to launch, eventually launch or implement your solutions. Actually, I'm just going to say one more thing. There's a researcher at UVA Darden Graduate School of Business, Jean Litka, who's done a lot of research in design thinking and actually uses the terminology that design thinking is social technology, and recognizes the strength of collaboration and conversation as a change agent. So she's one of my favorite researchers in this field. So I invite you to look her up if you are interested. And back to Heather.
Okay, so actually, Nancy, could you go back one slide for just a second?
Yeah.
So as Nancy was saying, there are a lot of different ways to think about design thinking, and it is a tool just like wrong theory. In fact, what I would say is that one of the reasons that wrong theory was explored by people like Vanessa is that she wanted to break out of this idea of a very linear kind of thought process, but it doesn't make it wrong, right? It's just another tool. And what I like about this particular representation of design thinking is that as an engineer, I like the verbiage that's on the top line, gathering data, getting insights, doing a design criterion, generating ideas, prototyping, testing. That is all language that I'm comfortable with and that I understand. In some of the other versions, because this comes from the world of design, they're using things like empathize and ideate, which is harder for me as an engineer to truly understand, but it's the same stuff, okay? So the idea here is, it's whether you're on North Campus or main campus, whether you are an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, or you are an engineer, there's a way to think of this as a process, okay? And the next parts that we're gonna get into are really kind of the thing to keep in mind from design thinking is don't go into it thinking that you know the answer without really going through the steps of trying to understand the problem, because you can wind up with something that's completely off the mark. All right, so let's get to the next slide. And these are the examples, or what I said was design fails. And I can say that because one of them's mine, but Nancy came up with a better language, which is flawed research design. And this idea is, so I know that quite a few people who have joined this meeting are developing their own research agendas. Shh. Sorry, that's my dog. I'm going to shut the door, one moment.
And I'll put the name of the researcher from UVA in the chat box.
Great. Okay, so these are examples of people who are failing to understand the true environment before they went forward. So for those of you who have seen the movie Hidden Figures, and that's about women at NASA that were the first computers, it was a whole group of Black women, including Kay Johnson and many other people that I think it came out 2 or 3 years ago. And there's a famous scene in this movie where one of the computers has to run all the way across campus and then run all the way back every time she needed to use the restroom, because this was during segregation era. And so her advisor or her supervisor was extremely frustrated because she was missing for so much of the day. That's not an accurate portrayal. There's, you know, it was greatly simplified. It was during the time of segregation, but as it turns out, they just disregarded the signs. There was no dramatic breaking of the signs. But this is an idea of failure to understand that when you're bringing people from a different background into the space to work on the project, are you looking at the hidden barriers that could be there to prevent them from participating? So I'm going to use one of my examples and one of Julia's as well. She was very kind to let us talk about this one. And this was literally my first month on campus. I was working on a large NSF Prem grant, which usually has a large research intensive institution such as Harvard, Yale, et cetera, really big name, partnering with a smaller institution that's maybe a minority serving institution or primarily undergraduate institution or whatnot. In this case, we were partnered with Harvard, and we also created a partnership with SIPI, which is the Southwest Indian Polytechnic Institute, which is here in Albuquerque as well. And this sounded like a great idea. We were going to have all kinds of lateral integration as well as horizontal as well as vertical integration across these multiple institutions. But we had a lot of problems with the link between UNM and SIPI that we hadn't anticipated. And this came up for several reasons. The first one is, in case you haven't worked with SIPI or other teacup institutions or tribal colleges, they are, in the case of SIPI, it is a residential campus. So the people are going to school on their own campus. Many of them don't have cars. If they do have cars, they don't have enough money to pay for gas to get from SIPI to UNM. And that was a big part of this proposal, was people who are studying at SIPI are going to come to UNM and work in our labs. We're going to train them how to do various things with material processing and whatnot. But if they don't, you know, a lot of them don't have cars. If they do have cars, they can't get gas. If they do have gas, they can't get parking at UNM, just like every other person on campus. That was a huge problem. But probably a bigger one was failure to appreciate that SIPI and other teacups actually are not on a semester system, they're on a trimester. So their schedules don't link up well between the two institutions. And furthermore, they don't have Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes or Tuesday, Thursday classes. Their classes go every day, similar to how high schools are for Albuquerque public school system. And so what that meant was, even if they could get to UNM, which was 4 barriers down, they still had a really hard time of getting their schedule to work so that they could come here and do research. And this is a great example, or a terrible example, of thoughtless design. It's not that we were purposely thoughtless, it's that we made a lot of assumptions at the beginning about the schedule and so forth that weren't accurate. And so if we had known a little bit more, we would have spent more time really thinking through what are some of these hidden barriers, such as the lack of access to campus, you know, the asynchronous partner schedule, et cetera, before we went forward. And, you know, it did cause a lot of problems for the proposal. It got funded. It caused a lot of problems for the grant itself. Nancy has another example that's from the opposite side of campus. So let's hear about that from Nancy.
Yeah, so in a study a few years back involving one of the pueblos, we realized that at that point in time, the Pueblo had you could call it a curfew. It was not COVID related, of course, but a kind of a curfew of wanting all residents to be home by dark. And so, as we approach the time change currently, dark is dark has a moving time associated with it. And so we were unfamiliar with this when we began, and we had to adapt our schedule to ensure that the participants could abide by this curfew. And that might have meant being on the road by not being available from, say, 4 p.m. after, because of the time change and the seasonal change. So I think all of these make assumptions. We make assumptions about how we can proceed, and wrong theory, design thinking, and universal design all lead us through processes that help us identify our assumptions and challenge them, kind of flesh them out before they become part of our research design, ideally.
Right. Okay, so this next slide, this is something that we're going to do together again. This is assuming that most people are either faculty who are creating a research area, or perhaps administrators who are working in degree areas. I am on a panel for the NIH's Training and Workforce Development programs. And so I review all the MARC, IMSD, RISE programs that come in, not all of them. I'm, one of like 40 evaluators, but we see a lot of applications where people are trying to create a new degree program within an existing department. And they always have verbiage in the language of NSF and NIH programs that are like this, that it needs to be transformative. They don't want an iterational approach. They want to have something that revolutionizes the department, that's innovative and impactful. So going back to the language that we spoke of earlier, this is not an incremental improvement. So it's not like, I have a master's degree program, I'm going to extend this to a PhD, or I have a chemical engineering degree program, I'm going to offer certificates within it according to the things that we already have here. It's really something like, I'm going to, in the old NSF lingo, it might be an IGERT brand new degree program, or it could even come from your own university. During this time and in the past couple of years, deans and administrators have been very interested in ways of how can we offer more things with the existing infrastructure that we've got. And so that is our prompt now. We are going to try and think of how to create a new degree program within an existing department. We're going to apply as a group for NIH funding in order to create student fellowships. That's our assumption. We want to make sure that we have funding to offer to these students. And if you haven't ever written a grant like this before, there's a requirement to have a recruitment and retention plan to enhance diversity. Okay, so let's think through together. I think in breakout rooms, if we can do it, sorry, can you go back?
Sure. And we were going to do a demo of it too, Heather.
Yeah, yeah. So let's think of this together about, it says, you're trying to recruit this type of person. Okay, so let's think through, Nancy, do you want to give us a type of person that we want to recruit?
Let's recruit a person that has a severe hearing loss from a rural area, first generation college.
Okay, that's a great example, because if we were just going to do an incremental approach, then the easiest thing to do is say, we are going to recruit Hispanic students and Native American students because we are a Hispanic serving institution. That seems like a natural next step. Obviously, we do want to recruit that type of student, but that's a little bit incremental. So Nancy is saying, let's move past that and say, in addition to the existing type of diversity that we've got, let's try and reach out to people who have disabilities in terms of hearing, and then geographic differences, which are also included in NIH's underrepresented groups category now. All right, so let's think about what are some of the incremental changes we've just talked about. You know, that might be recruiting Native American or Hispanic students that are already kind of in our pipeline. So what would a transformational change look like? Okay, so we're going to recruit that type of student. What might we do, Nancy, since you've worked with people who have hearing losses, what might we do in order to make our program more attractive in, let's say, engineering to someone who has a hearing loss?
Well, just thinking of wrong theory, a bad idea came up, which would be, you know, obviously relying on like radio advertisements or even TV advertisements. So you might want to look into, you know, Facebook group or student groups that attract individuals with hearing loss and have an understanding of kind of the deaf community, those with severe hearing loss, moderate hearing loss, kind of the differences, what this individual really needs to recognize that he or she could actually be part of this program.
Right.
What else?
I think that you know, one of the first things we might do is go on campus to Accessibility Resource Center. Joan Green has been the director for quite some time. I know that she's stepping down and someone else is taking her place. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the individual, but one of the first things we could do is just find out how many deaf students do we have on campus? How many hard of students do we have on campus? Because they would have the best idea of what kind of assistive devices are available, who's using them on campus, and also they have the ability to poll students and to email them and say, is this something you're interested in? Would you be, you know, willing to be on like an advisory committee or something like that? Otherwise, you're going to be starting off with assumptions, right? So I think that's a great idea. And then again, this whole process should be somewhat iterative. So it's something that we should be doing before we write the proposal, right? Not at the very last minute, which is somewhat transformative, an idea of itself. All right, so let's go to the next one.
So we're going to invite you all to just kind of think about what are the hidden barriers in currently at the moment in some of the your research or your research plans that may be preventing you from including a really diverse pool of participants. If perhaps you are involved in developing a new department or really wanting to broaden your existing department in certain ways, like what gets in your way? And this is a little bit of a paradox because, I mean, hidden barriers, these aren't things that are gonna pop right out at you necessarily, but just kind of reflect for a moment. And
now let's give them about 40 seconds.
okay.
I'll give you guys a prompt, which is that in the case of chemistry students, which is what my PhD was in, I know that when I was TAing for chemistry, I saw a lot of issues in the Gen Chem labs because you know how you get those prompts from the Accessibility Resource Center. We would have those prompts saying this person has a visual impairment or whatnot. And we were doing things in the lab that were like titrations that involve a colorimetric change. And for some reason, Gen Chem intro always has a lot of that kind of thing, which has very little to do with what I do now. Right? There's absolutely no colorimetric change. So just think through what you do in your lab. Sorry, Nancy, let's start them over with some time. But just think through what you do in your lab or in your research that might be difficult for someone who does have a visual impairment or who comes from a rural environment or has a hard of hearing or something like that. Okay, so let's give you some time. And in the chat, just kind of throw out something that might be a difficulty. Right. Okay. So the first one that came in is hearing the hood alarms. So I run a tissue culture laboratory and almost everything has alarms that go beep, 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 like there's too little CO2 in the incubator, or the temperature's off or something like that, but they don't flash, they just beep. And so that would be really difficult. That would make it something that I wouldn't have thought of. That's a great one. Zoom lectures is something that Tamar Ginasar says. And I agree. If someone is, you know, we've all had to move to Zoom very quickly. If we haven't thought through the Zoom very well, we may have designed it poorly. So for example, Amy Kashua says, not everyone has access to technology or reliable internet. That is absolutely true. We've all seen images of kids that are hanging out in front of Taco Bell and stuff like that because they don't have internet at home. If I'm creating a Zoom lecture that has a ton of visuals and stuff that they have to play videos and so forth, that could be really causing a lot of problems for those individuals, as well as, you know, if you're doing only PowerPoint visuals, then that's not going to work for someone who has a visual problem, right? So those are great. There's also height adjustable printing presses. I'm at Tamarind. That's great. So Tamarind is the art institute that's downtown. So yeah, absolutely. If something is not in the range of an individual, especially someone who's either much shorter or in a wheelchair or whatnot, it could be just literally out of their reach. This is actually a huge problem in medical school, because one of the things that you have to do to demonstrate that you are a competent doctor is the ability to use your stethoscope to listen to breathing. And if you're not able to reach up to the bed because you're a shorter individual, this can, oh, she says we're next to Harton, not downtown, sorry. I think that is, you know, that is going to be a huge problem. All right, our classes are based on discussion. So even with access, it is hard to follow for someone with hearing loss. Absolutely, because there's not a chat necessarily. So hopefully we'll be able to add captions to what we're saying so that if people have visual, or sorry, auditory, hard of hearing and so forth, that we'll be able to make that accessible to them. All right, so great job, everyone. Let's move on to our next slide. Okay, so let us now, we've shared some hidden barriers. What we want to do now is really use wrong theory. And we want you guys to be in groups. If we can set up breakout groups, I've never done that. So I think someone's going to help you do that.
Yeah,
but
we're going to do pairs also.
Okay. So our idea here is you're just going to be paired with someone. I want you to think about what is the worst possible way to recruit one type of person that is from this diverse population into your proposed graduate program, okay? So it might be someone with visual impairment, might be someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, urban environment, whatnot, but just come up with the most humiliating and harmful. That's really important. The most humiliating and harmful way to increase that person's representation in your graduate program. Okay, let's do that.
We'll give you 2 minutes, a whopping 2 minutes. So in like 60 seconds each, share this with one another, and then we'll come back and ask for some feedback.
Thank you for participating in that, and thank you for setting that up, because I'd never done breakout rooms and that seemed to work really well. All right, so could everybody in the chat share some of the ideas that they came up from their wrong thinking exercise? You don't have to do all of them, just a couple.
It looks like not everybody's back yet.
Okay. So for those who have just come back, what we're doing is in the chat, I'd like for you to try to share some of your wrong thinking ideas into the chat. The first one we have is advertise the course only on the radio. absolutely, that is not going to work for our friends that are deaf and hard of hearing. I agree. But you would not believe how many people start off with that kind of idea. All right, do we have some other thoughts? I see Mary Jo on my screen. So Mary Jo, did you have some ideas? Wheelchair bound printers faced with building with stairs. Now this is actually a huge problem. And I refer to this as ADA compliant buildings that are not ADA friendly. It could very well be that you have a building that's been adapted over time. Certain entrances have been updated enough so that you can't get in or out. And that can create a problem with a building that was once ADA compliant that is no longer. I know that we face that in engineering. We've got this idea of label students by their diversity and always refer to them that way. Absolutely. That is not inclusive, is it? If we're always referring to someone by their issue first. I think that is I would hate to be called the disabled one, right? Because that's not how I want people to immediately think of me. I think that's a great one. Sending letters and materials with small font and too many words, the font that is too difficult to read. Absolutely. People have visual issues. That is going to be immediately off-putting, telling them this is not meant for you. Mary Jo says, use images of urban settings and styles as desirable when recruiting from rural areas. Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the same issues with brochures that are trying to recruit people that are always showing the same exact happy students doing the same thing across campus, right? It could also be the exact opposite of showing everyone like the duck pond, when the duck pond is the only place that looks like that on UNM campus. Using a recruitment podcast for deaf students, absolutely. Ignoring them once recruited, absolutely. You have to, this is recruit and retain, right? You have to make sure that you are not only recruiting people, but you're making them feel welcome and included and important and vital to your research. Absolutely. Okay, so do you have any other things that you want to share here, Nancy?
I like that the responses include both like visual and auditory accessibility, but also the culture piece. So like urban versus rural, that's really something that gets at the cultural diversity in addition to other kinds of diversity. So,
and if you haven't checked out what the list of diverse populations is as defined by the NIH, it's really expansive. It started off as only underrepresented minorities defined by a specific category. Then they started to include women, not for biological research, but because there are so many women in biology, but women in engineering are considered underrepresented. And then they recognize that people with disabilities should be included in that category. It's expanded now to being first generation college goers, people from very rural environments, people from very urban environments. There's just a lot of different backgrounds that people are trying to include now. All right, giving, let's see, giving full-time working people course overload. Oh, that is such a terrible thing. And we're seeing so much of it right now, aren't we? Showing a diverse population and having a picture of only one race/gender. I love that. That actually, we had to reject the initial brochure that was coming out for the chemical and the biomedical engineering graduate program. Only had pictures of men who were white in the brochure for the first version that came out. And I was like, first of all, that's not even accurate. Our program is more than half of it is women. And furthermore, why would you be sending this out? You know, this is a terrible way to try and recruit people. We want people who are from different backgrounds. All right, I love this, the UNM homepage. Oh, Eva, yes, I love it. Sorry, Ava. Yes, the UNM homepage could definitely do with some rethinking. Okay, so great examples, everyone. I really, really like it. So let's move on to the next slide, Nancy.
So we've got 5 minutes left. So why don't we give a 60 seconds for people to think about improved designs,
So we
improved
did the
design
wrong
ideas?
thinking. Yeah, let's now think of what we could do, and we're not going to break out. Let's just do this as a chat. What could we do? Just think of the things that you've already identified as the wrong ways. Let's see if we can think of something that would be a better way to recruit this population. Okay, so let's see if you can come up with some better ideas on the right-hand side. All right, so Nika has said hood alarms that have sounds, light, and a slight vibration. Love it. Proactive ADA planning. Absolutely, that is going to be vital, especially thoughtful if you can include people with different disabilities on the group, right? So that they can be right there in on the planning sessions. All right, I see Julia's face. It looks like she's typing into us. Truly diverse team when planning. I love that. Having a diverse planning team will help you avoid the issues, especially like the ones that we talked about earlier of not understanding that there was a trimester versus a semester. Get advice from current students. That's a great idea, Julia, because a lot of students have different issues than we do. And they're going to be telling us what is a huge barrier and what is something that is reasonable.
Can I just point out, a lot of these examples are examples of kind of empathy, the empathy phase, where you'd actually immerse yourself or get shoulder to shoulder with your end user or end beneficiary.
Right. Engage students from different communities. I love that idea. Students appreciate knowing that their advice is being taken into account. And in fact, I have to tell you guys, we had an entrance into my building on campus that I only learned was sort of a trap, literally a trap for people in wheelchairs from students, because after taking my class, they identified, you know what, you can get into this vestibule, but then you can't get out of it. There's no wheelchair access button to get out of this vestibule. And even if you did then be able to get out, you couldn't leave the building because there's only stairs down. So that is the kind of thing that the students told me. So this kind of thing can really help. I like this idea of allowing anonymous feedback too, because if you are getting feedback from students, current or former, they may be very hesitant to share something that they think could go down poorly.
And Carol Westby mentioned making clear the types of services that are available from disability services.
Right, and engaging with them early.
Right.
All right.
So I think we should check in with the advanced folks. We're at 12:58. Shall we proceed or go to questions?
I think you can. I'm assuming you're almost done, so I think you should proceed, and people can stay. If they have to leave, we'll post this.
Okay.
And they can catch up. And if anyone has to leave and you have questions, please put them in chat, and we'll post them as part of the write-up for the session.
Thank you.
So this last couple of slides, this idea is from this book from 1992, Reinventing Government. The reason I put this in here is because there's this quotation at the beginning: what gets measured gets done. If you don't measure the results, you can't tell the success from the failure. And the last slide, the last part is, if you can demonstrate results, you can win public support. This particular book was used by the NSF and the NIH to really come up with a whole idea of evaluation programs and assessment programs. And that is, you need to understand what the problems are first and then compare it to the goal later. Now, there are obviously problems with assessment and evaluation programs, but this is where the NIH and NSF thinking is. So what's one simple thing that you can do right now in order to start showing that you are committed to this type of research? Nancy, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so this is a very simple spreadsheet that I created when I was a brand new baby professor. This was actually in response to some of Julia's advice. And what I started doing was I kept a list of the names of every single student and postdoc that I ever worked with. I've blacked or purpled them out on the left-hand side so you can't see who they are. But I took note of their student status. Were they an undergrad, a grad student, a postdoc, etc. I looked at what gender they were from, what was their race race, or ethnicity. Over time, I also added if they were coming from a background of having, been a veteran, or if they had a disability. And then down at the below, I calculated what the percentage was over time. So this is actually not even accurate anymore. It's like from last year, but this is to show you I was keeping track of what kind of group I had from the very beginning. This is now information that I put in my bio sketch, I put it in my CV and so forth. And it does two things. Number one, it shows people that I really am committed to recruiting and promoting students from a diverse background. And also the fact that I'm tracking it shows that I'm serious about it, right? It also shows that if I'm seeing that, oh, wait, I've recruited a lot of people from group X, but not group Y, I can start thinking about how to recruit from a different group. This is a simple thing that you can start doing right now in order to set yourself up for more success in the future. All right, next slide, Nancy.
So we've obviously flown by a lot of concepts here. There is one aspect of design thinking and wrong thinking is to never give people enough time to really finish anything. This is like maxing that out in an hour. But if you have more, if you're curious about design thinking, I will be teaching a 3-session course through continuing ed that starts next week on Thursdays, 1:30 to 3:30. So it's 3 Thursdays in November, and I'll probably do it again in the spring if you're interested. And these are some of the acknowledgements. We mentioned Vanessa Svila, Dr. Ty Martin, Ms. Veronica Mitchell, and of course, Julia at Advance and her crew at Advance. We'd like to thank all of you. And then finally, questions, if we have any. I don't know. And you can just unmute at this point if you want, if you have some questions. Whoops.
I have a question, Nancy.
Sure.
Your continuing education Thursdays, is
Right.
that, do you have to be enrolled in the university, or can someone outside take it?
Someone from the outside can take it. It is, I think, if you're with UNM, you can do tuition remission, but anyone can sign up for it.
Thank you.
Sure.